Today, it's a different type of paper than the paper I presented yesterday. For those that were present yesterday, let me just say something about the link between the two. Yesterday, I presented an account of Epibole, which is a notion with great epistemological importance, and it is upgraded but treated from the beginning since Epicurus as a criterion of truth. And of course, this is crucial for scientific theory and scientific practice in Epicureanism. The criteria of truth are the foundations of our knowledge and our scientific investigation for the Epicureans. So the link basically is epistemological between the two lectures. And we also see how work in the philosophy of mind can be extended and applied to the philosophy of science. Um, Today's paper is a synthetic paper, like yesterday's paper. So it is an overall account of the topic that I have undertaken to discuss. It's an account of a method that is a controversial method in Epicureanism and that has not been taken seriously ever by Epicurean critics, ancient critics. Modern scholarship is scarce on it. What there is of extremely high quality. So the method is beginning basically to be restored. And it is in that spirit that I am offering this study. The paper is a very long paper, and therefore I can only present the bare bones of the argument. And I shall try to keep the time below an hour. So there is a handout of translated texts, but unlike yesterday, I shall read little of that. It is for your information and also to aid the discussion. I should be referring to the text, reading a few lines, but that will be it. I hope that some of the details of the account are going to come up in the discussion, and I shall have the opportunity to fill them in. So Epicurus famously claimed that the primary function of the science of nature is the discovery of the cause of the most important things. And moreover, he claimed that the understanding of this cause, as well as of the causes of the meteora, conventionally rendered as celestial phenomena, but comprising much else, is essential to our happiness. The method suitable to the study of the meteora is, on his view, the polakos tropos, the method of multiple explanations, according to which each of the meteora can be accounted for in several different ways, and all of them must be accepted in the absence of counter-evidence. It seems that the use of the polakos tropos was considered canonical and was practiced routinely by Epicureans of all periods. Among us moderns, however, the method of multiple explanations has raised eyebrows, and the contention that its practice is essential to human well-being has appeared, at the very least, puzzling. For it doesn't seem prima facie plausible to assume that astronomical and meteorological phenomena typically admit of multiple explanations, nor is it evident how such a concession could contribute to human flourishing. Worse, many have formed the impression that Epicurus is awfully casual about the number or quality of the explanations that can be offered. For in the letter to Pythocles, he frequently ends his analysis of a celestial or an atmospheric phenomenon by saying that, in addition to the explanations that he has given, there are many other explanations. So it is this sort of remark that has appeared to suggest that virtually any explanation would do, provided that it is psychologically effective. So pragmatism of a very crude form is what Epicurus is basically accused of. But the surviving writings of Epicurus and his followers suggest a very different story. My aim is to offer my own perspective on key aspects of the method, propose a rather Unitarian account of the use of polakos tropos by Epicureans of different periods, and contend that the central epistemic intuition of the method is philosophically defensible in its own right. Part one of this paper places the method of multiple explanations in a dialectical context and identifies one of its main targets. Part two articulates Epicurus' conception of polakos tropos, its objectives, range, metaphysics, modalities, justification, and constraints. Part three discusses the polakos tropos in later Epicureans, namely Zeno of Sidon, Lucretius, and Diogenes. Part four, which is very brief, comments on the ethical importance of the polakos tropos and its credentials. Part one, Epicurus is not the inventor of the method of multiple explanations. As a philosophical and scientific method, the latter originated in Aristotle, but the first known philosopher who employed it systematically was Theophrastus. We may safely assume that at the time of the composition of Epicurus on nature, the polakos tropos is a scientific method that is around, and many consider it, if not acceptable, at least respectable. It has been sanctioned by the head of the Lyceum, is associated with investigations of the world of experience, and is closely tied to the observation and analysis of certain kinds of celestial and atmospheric events. Traditionally, the term meteora is rendered by celestial phenomena, but in Epicurus it covers much more. The list of phenomena discussed in the letter to Pythocles reveals that the meteora include not only events and phenomena in the heavens, but also in the atmosphere and the earth, and they range from cosmic events such as world formation and shape to trivial occurrences like weather signs. Some of these phenomena are spectacular, others are not. Some have regularity, but others do not. Some occur frequently and others very rarely. Some are catastrophic, but others harmless, beneficial, or even pleasant to behold. The rainbow is one of them. Even though family resemblances can be traced between these cases, it is not immediately obvious what all of them might share in common. Metaphysically and epistemologically, the meteora in question belong to the genus of adila, non-evident things. They remain hidden from us in their own proper nature, but can become known in some ways through signs or proofs. However, the class of things generically non-evident is by no means coextensive with a meteora. Atoms, void, and simulacra do not become immediately manifest either. Non-evidence then covers a huge range, including microscopic entities and events. And furthermore, it seems that even though Epicurus reserves the method of multiple explanations mainly for certain celestial and terrestrial phenomena, he doesn't hesitate to occasionally employ it in other contexts as well. Um, Generally, I submit that he makes a strong case for the metaphysical grounding of the polakos tropos, its epistemic virtues, and its eminent suitability to the subject matter of events in the heavens. These elements emerge most clearly in his criticisms, explicit or implicit, against the astronomers of Cyzicus. In the Treatise on Nature, Book 11, he attacks a model of mathematical astronomy probably developed by the great geometer and astronomer Eudoxus and still applied by the astronomers of the school of Cyzicus in Epicurus' time. In rough outline, Epicurus points to two interrelated mistakes that one can make, and as a matter of fact, the astronomers do make in trying to account for phenomena in the heavens. One, they fail to realize that some things can have only one cause or generation, whereas other things can have many. And correspondingly, two, they don't distinguish between things that admit of only one explanation and things that admit of many. Both these failures are due to epistemic inadequacy, and both can be traced back to the astronomers' fascination with theory and their disregard for observation and empirically grounded reasoning. So this is the outline of Epicurus' position against the astronomers of Cyzicus. Look please at text 2 in your handout. While the astronomers endeavor to work out the mathematics of the motions of the celestial bodies and offer a single model for them, this is simply not feasible from the human viewpoint. I quote, why, after all, should you declare the measurement from here, or the one from there, or the one from there, or this one a more reliable guide of the risings and settings of the sun? End quote. Here, Epicurus is pointing out that objectively valid calculations cannot be made from any point on the surface of the Earth. In other words, Eudoxus's geometrical model of interconnecting concentric spheres is inadequate. It cannot account for the variations and irregularities that we can observe in the motions of the heavenly bodies. According to texts 3 and 4 in your handout, Eudoxian astronomers construct mental models, homeomata, and base their reasonings on instruments, organa, that they construct. And these instruments, David Sedley has compellingly argued that they must be planetaria of sorts. And the most sophisticated kind of this sort of machine we see much later in the Antikythera mechanism. But this, Epicurus argues, that is, basing constructing models on the basis of theory is wrong, for the indications of the instruments cannot serve as a basis of an analogy with the meteora that we actually see in the heavens. While an arbitrarily constructed instrument is concrete and its properties determinate, there are indeterminacies, auristei, in the appearances of the celestial bodies. An astronomical instrument is an object whose properties are observable and known, whereas a meteoron is an image whose causes are unobservable and their nature unknowable. As things stand, he continues, the instruments of the astronomers are deceptive. Their use of the monachos tropos, the method of a single explanation, is motivated by theoretical presuppositions ascribing to the meteora a regularity and perfection that they simply don't have, according to Epicurus. Now, this approach to the meteora is part and parcel of a way of doing astronomy traced back to Plato's Academy and bringing to our mind the higher level education of the Guardians in Republic 7, an education intended to turn them away from the world of experience and towards the eternal and immaterial forms. Now it's time to see what Epicurus can present, can offer us as an alternative. Part 2. In the programmatic section of the letter to Pythocles, these are texts 5 and 6 in your handout, first Epicurus determines his stance vis-a-vis the two rival modes of explanation, accounting for a phenomenon monachos in only one way or polakos in several different ways. I am reading a small part of text 5, quote, we must not try to force an impossible explanation, nor must we have, with regard to every subject, the same theoretical approach, namely the one concerning the modes of life or the solution to other physical problems. For instance, that the universe consists of bodies and the intangible, or that the elements are indivisible, and all such claims that we make where there is only one explanation in accordance with the phenomenon. This doesn't hold in the case of the meteora. Rather, these events have both a cause of generation that can be diverse, a pleonakin aitian, and multiple accounts of their ousia, their nature, that accord with sensation. End quote from text 6 now. Our mode of life has now no place, says Epicurus, for irrational thinking. And several lines down towards the end of the text, quote, when a person retains one explanation but rejects another, although it is equally in agreement with the phenomena, it is evident that he abandons completely scientific research and recurs to the realm of myth. End quote. The first thing to note is that Epicurus is far from rejecting the monakos tropos altogether. This is a fairly common misunderstanding in interpretations of the method of multiple explanations, namely that Epicurus does not accept single explanations. This is, of course, a mistake, as you can see in the text. On the contrary, Epicurus believes that certain aspects of nature and of the human life can be explained correctly in one way only. Namely, there is a single theoretical account, which is true of the first principles constituting the universe, the indivisibility of atoms, the way to live our lives, the criteria of truth, and a handful of other items. These are, as we saw yesterday too, the Kyriotata, the most important beliefs that serve as the cornerstones of the Epicurean system. The single explanations corresponding to them hold absolutely and universally, and they are not negotiable. They constitute the very framework in which the multiple explanations of celestial phenomena must be integrated. How exactly the unique explanations of the Kyriotata are related to the multiple explanations of other types of explananda remains unspecified. But Epicurus makes clear that these two methods and their respective objects must remain distinct and separate in our mind. It is imperative for us, Epicurus argues, to avoid the confusion that the Platonist astronomers fall into in that regard. Whether a phenomenon or a type of phenomenon admits of only one explanation or of many is determined on ontological and causal grounds, as you can see in text 7, which I won't read, I will comment on. So far as I can tell from this text and others, Epicurus does not draw a sharp distinction between explanation and cause. He seems to assume that the number of causes that may be responsible for the generation of a phenomenon corresponds to the number of explanations that may be offered for that phenomenon. Things that have a single cause and can't be otherwise require a single explanation. Things that can have multiple causes and can be otherwise require multiple explanations. What determines the appropriate method are causal features of the world, not arbitrary assumptions. The method must accommodate reality and not the other way around. We can now better understand why Epicurus considers the meteora the prime object of polakos tropos or dynatos tropos, as it also is called. The meteora have many causes, and they must therefore receive many explanations. In every such case, the multiple explanations represent, to use a phrase that Francesca Masi has very effectively used, causal possibilities, each of them sufficient to account for the occurrence of the corresponding events. It doesn't tell us, however, whether the multiple explanations accounting for a celestial event all hold true synchronously or asynchronously in this world or in some other world. So these questions, I believe, are questions that Epicurus leaves underdetermined. Another reason that Epicurus adduces in favor of the polakos tropos also bears on ontology and raises an epistemological issue as well. In text 3 in your handout, in his polemic against the astronomers, he points out that the risings and settings of the sun have indeterminate elements, as I mentioned, and these can't be captured by a single explanation, whereas they are adequately captured by multiple ones. So there is a certain indeterminacy inherent in the polakos tropos too, which is intended precisely to correspond to the indeterminacies of the particular phenomena that the polakos tropos is suitable for. Physically, Epicurus is likely to be referring here to the indeterminacies in the atoms and their compounds, which allow for multiple possibilities in multiple worlds, or alternatively, multiple possibilities in this one. Epistemologically, he probably has in mind the following three features. One, the meteora are at a great distance from us, and thus we don't have the capacity to perceive them fully. Two, what we perceive is not their natures and causes, but mere appearances. And three, these appearances can be misleading. They need not be, but they can be, and we can never be sure. In text 8, Epicurus strongly suggests that distance makes it impossible for us to have perceptual access to anything other than mere appearances segregated from the factors that brought them about. While our perceptions are true of these segregated images, they can't be trusted to reveal the true nature of the event or its cause. Assuming then that we accept the Polakos what guides us, what guides can we use? Epicurus' general guideline is that we must determine the causes of the meteora and their attributes in accordance with sensation and as the phenomena suggest. The last phrase is quoted from Pythocles 86. In other words, what he recommends is that in applying the Polakos tropos, we should attend to the fundamental criterion of aesthesis, sensation or perception, and rely on observation and evidence. Additional elements of Epicurean methodology and science also bear on the method of multiple explanations. The use of science, the analogies between the meteora and things parhumin, close to us, the verificatory procedure of non-contestation, the comparative and simultaneous survey of relevant accounts, which is frequently led by means of epilogismos, and the epistemic feature of precision. Let's look briefly at these items in turn. First, signs. I quote, signs indicating what happens in the meteora are carried by some of the phenomena on Earth, which are observed where they occur, not by the phenomena manifest in the meteora, for these can happen in many ways, end quote. It is striking that the signs serving as the basis of inferences about the meteora shouldn't come from the meteora themselves, but from objects or events in our own vicinity. Why, one might wonder, may we not infer thunder from lightning? Or why may we not rely on weather signs in order to predict an eclipse? Because, I propose, such signs are merely what came to be called commemorative signs. They tell us nothing about causes. All they tell us is something about causal associations, but nothing about the true nature of the cause. The observable manifestations of a meteoron are unreliable as an indicative sign of a hidden cause that has brought the meteoron about. Why so? Not only because they are very distant from us, but also because they are isolated episodes whose transient and fleeting character bears no necessary relation to their respective apparent causes. While we are told in text 6 that the Polakos tropos must take these images too into account, they can't do the work that the so-called inductive signs are expected to do in respect of generically non-evident things, namely to reveal their causes. Things close to us, however, the parhumin, can play that role, for they are not mere appearances of some unobservable nature far away, but earthly realities whose causes we can readily observe and whose generation we can readily explain by reference to those causes. Their epistemic function is peculiar, however, for unlike straightforward analogical arguments involving inductive signs, analogical inferences from the causes of things close to us to the causes of the meteora do not aim to establish the correctness of a single explanation. They aim to bolster the diversity of multiple ones. The method that Epicurus employs is not attestation, but non-contestation. While the former, attestation that is intended to confirm a hypothesis to the exclusion of all others, non-contestation allows several explanations to stand so long as they are not falsified by the evidence. Finally, look again, please, at text 4. For there, Epicurus attributes to the polakos tropos and the analogical reasoning that goes with it, akribeia, precision. This is in Pythocles 80. While the context of this remark is ethical, as we shall see later, the point, the nature of the remark, the virtue that brings us close to the telos of human life is an epistemic virtue. The investigation of the celestial phenomena by means of polakos tropos is as precise and as accurate as the subject matter allows, and this is why it can secure tranquility. All in all, Epicurus presents the polakos tropos as a genuine scientific method aligned with the materialistic physics and the empiricist epistemology of his school. It is now time to move on to the reception and developments of that method by his later followers. The Epicureans this is part 3. The Epicureans of the late Hellenistic and Roman periods, specifically Lucretius and Diogenes of Oinoanda, mostly endorse Epicurus's conception of the polakos tropos. Their accounts, however, present new and distinctive elements, and one of the questions I wish to address is whether or how these elements may be incompatible with the canonical version of the method. At the outset, a note about Zeno of Sidon, head of the garden in the early 1st century BCE and the teacher of Cicero and Philodemus. Zeno is the only Epicurean recorded as a critic of the polakos tropos. In particular, he raises objections to the analogies between the meteora and the parhumin, that is, the causal processes in our direct experience. In the context of an argument against Dionysius of Cyrene, a Stoic mathematician and pupil of Diogenes of Babylon, he points out that the causes accounting for the size of the sun may be different from the causes accounting from the size of things in our experience. Thus, he casts doubt on the legitimacy of analogies between the meteora and things close to us. But no other Epicurean philosopher is known to have pursued this line of criticism, something that at the face of it could be surprising because Zeno was quite a figure at his time and very influential, head of the garden. He had lots of pupils. Nevertheless, we don't know of anybody else that is taking this line of criticism. Lucretius, for one, ascribes great importance to the polakos tropos, but while he closely follows Epicurus in his sequential treatment of the meteora, he deals with very similar phenomena as the letter to Pythocles, etc. Nonetheless, his approach has a different focus and a different metaphysical and epistemological slant. In the first place, even though he occasionally concerns himself with astronomical theories, as you can see in text 9 of your handout, his principal target is not philosophical astronomy, but popular theology and superstition. And I quote from this text. I shall now explain how furious storms of winds arise and how they are calmed, so that all is once more what it was, changed and with its fury appeased. These are events that abase the spirit of people through the fear of the gods, keeping them crushed to the earth because their ignorance of causes compels them to attribute events to the power of the gods and yield to them the place of kings. End quote. In the second place, while Epicurus does not draw explicit connections between the doctrine of infinite worlds and the method of multiple explanations, Lucretius does. In text 10, we have there a very important passage that articulates the so-called principle of plenitude. The principle of plenitude is the principle according to which everything possible is also actual. So this is text 10, I quote. Which of these causes holds in our world? It is difficult to say for certain, but what may be done and is done through the whole universe in the various worlds made in various ways, that is what I teach, proceeding to set forth several causes which may account for the movements of the stars throughout the whole universe. One of which, however, must be that which gives force to the movement of stars in our world too, for which maybe the true one is not his to lay down, who proceeds step by step. End quote. According to Lucretius here, there are many possible causes, but only one of them is operative in this world, and only one explanation is true, even though we can't know which one this is. The other causes named for that event are possibilities that remain alive insofar as they are uncontested by the facts. However, each of them is the actual operative cause in some other world. According to this principle, then, what is possible is also actual somewhere in the infinity of the universe and in the infinite worlds in it. Text 11 drives the point home by means of an analogy with something close to us. And I read, you may perhaps think it proper to name all the causes of death. If you see somebody that is lifeless in the street, you may think it proper to name all the causes of death in order that the one true cause of the man's death may be named. For you couldn't prove that steel or cold has been the death of him, or disease, or maybe poison. But we know that what has happened to him is something of this sort. End quote. Admittedly, this is a very odd analogy, for the event of the man's death could be overdetermined in principle, and also the analogy seems to undercut the frequentist interpretation according to which all possibilities are equally probable within the constraints of experience. And so the approach that this passage suggests, that T11 suggests, may well appear unorthodox. Prima facie, it is unorthodox. However, Lucretius could perhaps present it as a legitimate elaboration of Epicurus's canonical doctrine. He could argue that since Epicurus posits infinite worlds, he is also committed to the actual multiplicity thesis. And an implication of this latter is that of all possible explanations of a celestial phenomenon, precisely one holds true of this world, and the same goes for every other world as well. Even so, the fact remains, I think, that Epicurus considers the polakos tropos the best, or indeed the only suitable method in order to account for a meteora. Lucretius, on the other hand, appears to recommend it faute de mieux. A different approach, yet a different approach to the polakos tropos is suggested by Diogenes of Oinoanda, the author of the monumental inscription, a 2nd century AD inscription that he had erected in his native town for the salvation of mankind. He too draws his principal material on the meteora from Epicurus, but nonetheless he engages with different rivals and is motivated by partly different philosophical concerns. Text 12 attests that one group of adversaries that he considers are hoi periton Socratin, Socrates and the philosophers that belong to the Socratic tradition, because, as he points out, they believe that natural science is useless. And we can see why an Epicurean would take exception to that. But Diogenes's main rivals in respect of the investigation of the meteora are, of course, not the Socratics, they are the Stoics. We are fortunate to have some of the details of his criticisms in the recently discovered new fragment 182, brilliantly edited and translated by Martin Ferguson Smith and Jürgen Hammerstedt. This is text 13 in your handout, and I quote selectively. If therefore the divine nature shall be deemed to have created things for its own sake, the result all these absurdities. If for the sake of humans, there are yet other, even more absurd consequences. And a few lines down in the fragment. Tell us in what ways a thunderbolt benefits life. How does it not even harm it? In what way flashes of lightning do? In what way clasps of thunder, the fall of hail, blasts and gusts of violent winds? In what way the irregular orbits of the stars and their differing sizes, the eclipses of the sun and the moon, and their spiral-shaped and oblique courses? In what way night benefits us when we can as well rest throughout the day? In what way the alternating lengths of days and nights? For of these phenomena, some are useless, others harmful. The meteora too have that character. End quote. I won't linger on that passage, for it has already received meticulous analysis. But I do want to point out that the immediate context in which Diogenes refers to the meteora here is that he is pursuing his attack against the Stoic thesis that the world is divinely created, purposeful, and the best possible. In fact, Diogenes argues both the natural world and human beings have so many features that are bad and purposeless that the world can't have been created by the gods either for their own sake or for the benefit of humans. The meteora enter the discussion at just that point as prime illustrations of the contention that nature is neither teleologically oriented nor always good for us. Two further features of Diogenes' account deserve attention. One elaborates a point already present in Epicurus, the other seems entirely new. And both occur in fragment 13 of the inscription, which is text 14 in your handout. The first part of the fragment is text 14, the second is text 15. So I am quoting from the first part, text 14. The heavenly bodies, when the whirls of air cause such strong motions, are all violently tossed about, but some crash into one another, while others don't. Some pursue a straight course up to a certain point, others, for instance, the sun and the moon, an oblique one, and others, like the bear, revolve in the same place. Again, some move in high orbit, others in a low orbit. End quote. Diogenes' purpose is to undermine the idea that there is perfect regularity in the motions of the stars in the heavens, an assumption that, as I mentioned, is closely connected to the Platonist astronomers and to creationism of all sorts. To counter it, Diogenes sketches a vivid picture of non-uniform, fragmented events in the celestial sphere, tossings and turnings, violent encounters, irregular trajectories, orbits that are high or low. The whole thing appears quite chaotic and to the religiously minded, very irreverent. The second part of the fragment, this is text 15 in your handout, appears to introduce a strikingly novel element to the method of multiple explanations, the selection of one explanation over others on the basis of, quote, what is more plausible. Text 15, I quote from the third line. If one sees that several explanations are possible, it is reckless to make a dogmatic pronouncement concerning any single one. Such a procedure is characteristic of a seer rather than a wise man. It is correct, however, to say that while all explanations are possible, this one is Pythanoteron is more plausible than that, end quote. Diogenes here introduces this new criterion with commendable caution. Even though one should accept that several explanations are possible, he says, it is correct to opt for the Pythanoteron, the more plausible one. Clearly, he is committed to this view himself, since he applies it in practice. In fragment 14, he says that we can accept, not unreasonably, one of the proposed explanations for hail. Now, admittedly, there is no close precedent of this view in Epicurus, but perhaps Epicurus does not really preclude opting for the explanation that is more Pythani, plausible or probable. In fact, he seems to have some such thought in mind when he says in Pythocles 87 that multiple explanations in accordance with the phenomena do not disturb us, provided that we accept, as we ought, to pythanologumenon, i.e., the plausible or probable accounts of phenomena. Besides, Epicurus has made clear that from an ethical point of view, the important thing is to accept the principle of multiple explanations. Now, provided we endorse the principle, it doesn't really make any difference which explanation we might have a psychological preference for. We might prefer over others. This is not going to affect our tranquility. Now, in sum, Lucretius and Diogenes do follow Epicurus, I claim, in viewing the polakos tropos as a scientific method which is open-ended but also has constraints set by experience. And regarding the issue of school orthodoxy, there are good reasons, I think, to favor a rather Unitarian interpretation of the polakos tropos throughout the history of the school. Despite some tensions, Lucretius and Diogenes should be viewed as enriching rather than contradicting the methodology set down by Epicurus. I shall end with a few remarks concerning the ethics of the polakos tropos. This is part 4, which is very brief. It is commonplace that the Epicureans' explanation of the meteora by means of the polakos tropos has an ethical purpose. But why is it so important to understand correctly these phenomena? And why do the Epicureans think that understanding them guarantees tranquility? Why do they believe that the method of multiple explanations is the only method for studying the meteora by which this aim, i.e., tranquility, can be attained? Consider again the sorts of phenomena that the Epicureans call meteora and their impact on human life. Whether they happen regularly or periodically, like the risings and settings of the sun and the moon, or randomly and unpredictably, like thunderbolts and earthquakes and falling stars, several of them are spectacular grand-scale events that could arouse strong emotions: delight, marvel, astonishment, perplexity, awe, and fear. Some of them would rightly be considered sources of the gravest danger, capable of destroying crops, cattle, buildings, individuals, and even entire cities. Consider the volcanic explosion of Vesuvius, which on Epicurus's book is volcanic explosions are meteora, and consider the destruction it has caused. Almost all of these phenomena are associated with Greek mythology and religion, and therefore were viewed by many ordinary people as manifestations of divine agency, beneficial or catastrophic. According to Lucretius, superstitions concerning the meteora are especially harmful. They incite terror in the soul, and they prevent those who feel that from approaching the shrines of the gods with peaceful heart and from receiving divine images. And this amounts to the fact that these people don't have moral exemplars and are condemned to live bad lives. Epicurus's remarks in the principal doctrines 10 to 13 are offered in precisely that spirit. As we saw, however, Epicurus's polemic is mainly directed at a dominant scientific approach to the meteora that can be traced back to Plato's Academy, an approach according to which the search for the single cause of each phenomenon goes hand in hand with the belief that there is regularity in the heavens and perfection in this world created for God for the sake and benefit of man. It is terribly important to realize that in rejecting the methods of the Platonist astronomers in favor of the Polakos tropos, Epicurus also rejects the theological doctrines that underlie it. Creationism, providentialism, and the method of single explanation stand or fall together. And the same holds conversely for the atomic composition of the universe, the mechanistic nature of all its workings, and the method of multiple explanations. The controversy is not merely about method, make no mistake about that. The controversy is about two competing worldviews, and these are not only about physics and astronomy, they are about how to live our lives. Thank you very much.